Duke Reads is a partnership with the Duke University Libraries and others who are listed on the Duke Reads webpage. And during the academic year, there will be 6 more opportunities to interact with faculty who have helped select the books for Duke Reads. Among them are Reynolds Price, Dean Sam Wells, and Sandy Williams. If you haven't signed up, you can find out more about it by visiting DukeReads.com. And Frank is going to talk some more about that later. Our panelists are very distinguished. We're very pleased to have them. We'll start with the Professor Alexander Downs. He's an assistant professor of political science at Duke. His principal research interests are the causes and effectiveness of civilian victimization in warfare and the origins and consequences of foreign-imposed regime change. He has actually written a book about this titled Targeting Civilians in War, which was recently published by the Cornell University Press. He's been at Duke for about Harvard John F. Kennedy School of Government, where he has been a fellow in the International Security Program at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. So welcome back to Duke.
Thank you.
Meg Foran is a junior. She is an English and linguistics double major and a French minor, and she's from Gainesville, Florida. Meg Foran at Duke is involved in the FAC program, the Alumni Association, the Inter-Community Council, and also DukeEngage. And perhaps during the course of the program, she can share with us a little bit more about that and what she learned in this context. Jin-Soo Huh is a senior, and he's from Rancho Cucamonga, California. He is also a double major in public policy and political science, and he has a minor in French. You're going to have to work to keep up with these guys. In addition to his involvement in the FAC program, which is the Freshman Advisory Council program, Jin-Soo is active in International Relations Association and also serves as a tour guide for visitors to the Duke campus. So if you need a special guide, I think you could mention his name and see what you can do. When he's also on the committee that selected the book, What is the What by Dave Eggers, which is the topic of our program today. And I think, as many of you know, this was the choice for all the freshmen. They read it and had programs during freshman orientation that helped them explore the themes in the book, which is what Frank Stasio is going to do, our moderator. And he is a well-known personality from his days at National Public Radio and has been a force in North Carolina since moving here to Chapel Hill. He does a program each weekday at noon and has really brightened the airwaves in North Carolina. His time at NPR involved him in All Things Considered, and his work now, he actually has a teacher hat that he wears frequently where he helps news stations learn how to put on news, and he also uses radio theater to teach those skills. So we have a very distinguished panel, and I will turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ann. I am very pleased to be here as part of the homecoming events, and particularly talking about this book, What is the What? I have to say I have a kind of a personal connection in that my daughter served as a nurse in southern Sudan after the Civil War to help repatriate returning Sudanese. And so she has been on me to read this book for a long time and says that all of this resonates with her in ways that I think many of us can't imagine. So I'm very happy to be talking about this. And I want to welcome you to the second year of Duke Reads. We're going to start with the summer reading selection, What is the What? And joining me, as you've just heard, Jin-Soo Huh, Megan Foran, and Professor Alexander Downs from Duke's Political Science Department. I think we should get right into this and ask you all what you thought of the book. Professor Downs?
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure, and I got to read the book in the last couple of weeks, and I thank Jin-Soo for bringing it to my attention. It's really an amazing book, an amazing story, incredibly poignant when you think the narrative style, for example, that goes back and forth between the main character's present experience in the United States versus what happened to him in his past in Sudan and Ethiopia and other countries. And sort of the absurdity or tragicness, or whatever the right word is, of someone who has come so far, endured so much, and gone through so much suffering to come to the U.S. only to be sort of victimized by a mundane petty theft, which is how the book starts off. And one of the most poignant moments of the book for me was when he's lying there on the floor, sort of drifting in and out of consciousness, thinking, gee, maybe I was better off in Sudan. Life was simpler there. I don't understand why these things are happening to me. But as a scholar and someone who studies the victimization of civilians as my academic research, I was obviously drawn to the parts of the book that sort of draw out points that I write about and that I teach in my class, Civilians in the Path of War, in the Political Science Department. A lot of what he describes about counterinsurgency, for example, and the counterinsurgency methods employed by the government of Sudan and associated militias, and how that sort of plays out in his story. The influence of third parties on the war. There's one scene where the entire refugee population has to flee Ethiopia and run for their lives because of a regime change in Ethiopia which was the primary supporter of the rebel movement. And also the issue of sort of refugees as political footballs, where they're not only victimized by the government, but then the rebels are constantly trying to recruit them into their ranks. Refugees, of course, are giant aid magnets, as I think he puts it at one point in the book. And the SPLA is not supposed to be present in the refugee camps, but is, and is taking their share of the food that's delivered, that's sort of siphoned off and helps kind of prolong the conflict. So those are some of the themes that I picked up on, and maybe we can come back to those as we go on.
Meg?
When I first got this book over the summer, it's one of those things that the summer reading book is always a really interesting choice because we do send it to freshmen, and this is their first real academic experience with Duke. And when I read the book, I was really gratified to see that they'd made a selection that was so significant, both in that it dealt with a really pertinent issue for the international scene right now and looking at across the world and dealing with these issues, but also a book that was so well written and so interesting in how it mixed a sort of humor with the sort of tragedy that was going on in it. And that's one of the things that I really love about this selection. I think that it does bring a level of sophistication to the discussion that the first years are going to have when they talk about it. It's a book that's incredibly worthwhile, both as a piece of literature, which I, of course, am always looking for coming out of the English department. I read books both to see if they're worth reading because they're about something significant, but I am always sitting there looking at how they're telling the story. And I think that the way that Eggers chose to write the book is really a testament to the type of material that he's dealing with. He deals with it in a very high-level way that I think it's really challenging for the freshmen to look at it that way, but also it's very rewarding once they do read the book. One of the things that we talked about a lot during orientation week with the first years was there's a very interesting dynamic between people who want to know exactly how much of it was true and how much of it wasn't. And coming at it myself, I took the project as something that maybe had some modifications in it, maybe a little bit of playing with the truth, but it never really occurred to me to worry about that issue. But I think the way that it's written, it really does lend itself to being above that. It's a book about a time and a place and what these people went through, and it's dealing with that. It does an incredibly wonderful job of doing that, and the way that Eggers tells the story, I think, really conveys it to a wider audience than maybe would look at it just as a civilian conflict. It really does a wonderful job of pushing that issue and pushing that into the general consciousness more than it would be just as a news story. So that was one of the things that really spoke to me, was looking at it as a piece of literature as well as a story about an incredibly important social issue that we're still dealing with.
Awesome. Well, I want to say thanks also for having me on this panel. And I guess I'll kind of speak to why the committee felt like this was a strong book to choose. And overall, we look at the books holistically when they're nominated. And I think that certain things that we do look for, and one of the things definitely is, does a book have literary merit? And it's kind of a hard balance because we also have to find a book that students are going to read. Because, if you had to have 1,700 students read them, we got nominations for like Crime and Punishment, and great books, great literary merit. But at the same time, you're not going to be able to have 1,700 freshmen read it. And also at the same time, you don't want something like Harry Potter, which I love, but it's not exactly a book that can be discussed totally intellectually. And for the summer reading, like one of the goals of it is we want to have an experience that first years we can show them, like, look, these intellectual discussions aren't limited to the classrooms. It's not just when you go to the library. They are alive in the commons room. They're alive in the marketplace. They're alive, when you're playing like tennis, like, you can talk about this, or, when you're walking to class together. It's alive and well. Like, Duke is an academic place that you can do this. And so I think this book did an especially good job in the sense that, I'm going to echo the points about humor. I mean, this was something that the literary merit, like Dave Eggers is an incredible writer, and he just told the story so beautifully that it just captivated everyone. I mean, I remember just like reading this book, and like I remember like I was a little intimidated by the length of it, but you just couldn't put it down because the story, you just, like when he's walking, even when he's just laying on the ground, just so like stunned, like, that he's being robbed at that point, like being called African Prince and things like that. That was, I just kept reading it. And also, one thing that we definitely struggled with was it was an interesting book, but we also said this isn't like a beach read. You're not gonna, you're definitely not gonna take it to the beach and like, this isn't like one that you're gonna read like, like hanging out by the pool. I mean, we encourage people to read it by the pool as well, but it's not that kind of book. But we enjoyed the fact that this was a relevant book. We thought that this was, we hope that none of the students in the class of 2012 can relate to a lot of these horrible things that he went through. But at the same time, there are a lot of important discussions, with Sudan going on right now. People know about Darfur, but not necessarily about the civil war. And there are also themes, about coming to America and like coming to a new place that we thought was extremely relevant. So I definitely enjoy this book. And if you didn't enjoy it, you can tell us. But I think that it was just an important issue, and also it illuminated some things about coming to America that was surprising for me.
Certainly the themes in this book are powerful, and we're tempted to start right in with the theme itself, but I think the question that you've all raised about the form of the book might get us at the themes in a different way, and perhaps more instructive way. You're dealing with, Professor Downs, the whole question, the very serious and real question of the impact of war on civilians. And they move, so they become the impact of war on civilians in the United States, and that becomes a big, broad picture. Is the way of telling this story, the fact that it's fictionalized, in any way a distraction from it? Can it take away from some of the research that you would do, the fact that it's not grounded in research and nonfiction? Is this more powerful or less powerful as a storytelling tool?
I definitely would not say it's less powerful. It's a different way of conveying something that you often read about in a very sort of detached, impersonal kind of way, which is also can be quite devastating. But this, to me, the sort of fictionalization of it did not detract at all, because a lot of what is said and what he describes in the book rings so true from research that I've done and reading that I've done about other conflicts, and then sort of going back and looking at the Sudanese conflict and sort of matching it up. Well, this is when this happened, and this is when that, and it gives you a perspective that you don't often get in academic studies, which is the individual stories and experiences of being forced from your home and forced to flee thousands of miles. Academic studies have a harder time conveying that.
And let me ask you the not quite the same question, but if you felt that you learned something new, about the conflict. Clearly, you're pretty well educated, and you knew what you were getting into when you picked up this book. But by the time you were finished, what was new for you?
I definitely didn't have any idea about the sheer scope of exactly what these people were going through, and that's exactly with what the professor just discussed. It's the question of understanding. Yes, you can understand there was this giant thing that happened to 100,000 people. There's this thing that happened with an entire country. But it's hard to bring that down to the human level and really understand what does that mean for a single person who's going through this conflict. What does it mean to be a person who's living here? And I feel that once you understand that a lot more, that's when you can kind of begin to think about what needs to happen next. Because it's one thing to say, one thing to talk about numbers, it's one thing to talk about percentages of a country. It's one thing to talk about these statistics and broad ideas and broad movements that happen, but it's quite another thing to say, this is what happened to one person, and how can we prevent that experience that this person went through from happening again? How can we deal with these cases that involve such broad scopes of people, but how can we think about them as individuals who are going through something? And I feel like that book does a really great job of bringing that issue to the forefront, in that it makes you think about each one of those 100,000 people or each one of those million people is a person that has their own personal experiences that they're bringing to it and their own individual experience of genocide, horror, being a political refugee. That's a very individual experience at the same time, even though we don't like to think about it that way a lot. So the book did a really great job of conveying that.
Jin-Soo?
I mean, I would definitely echo those sentiments, and I think that I think Eggers did a really good job of describing the people in the book. Like, you got to see, like, you know, of course there are some, like, horrible things that he went through, but there were also some good moments that he went through, just, like, even working or, like, just hanging around in the very beginning when he talks about his friends and how his friend just lies a lot and he just makes up these grandiose stories. And, I mean, like, little things like that was like, oh, you know, like, I have friends like that too. And, like, just knowing that. And when you realize, like, these are people, like, you know, like, because, like, I think that's something when you read a newspaper, like, X number of people died, and you go, that's a lot of people, but it's a statistic. But when you meet this one person, like, really intimately get to know this person, and, you know, like, even, like, the funny things, you're like, you know, like, I think that was something that really humanized it, was that there were, like, you knew that this person was experiencing these emotions, and at the same time, like, you know, they're experiencing things like people getting eaten by lions. Like, that was, I mean, extreme, but I mean, I think that was what, you know, just getting the details. And I think, because I mean, I had studied a little bit about Sudan, but just getting those full details. And I think for the fictionalization part, I think he was very upfront about it in the very beginning, like in the very first, like in the intro, like saying there were some things, you know, for conversations. But more importantly, I think there was one quote in the book that was really interesting. Was he was kind of saying that, like, a lot of the stories kind of melded together. Like, a lot of the Sudanese lost boys, like, they would say, oh, well, that happened to me too, and the stories came together. So I think even if for some of those things, like, he, you know, it was definitely still part of the Sudanese lost boys experience, and I think that doesn't take away from that experience.
You know, and I should tell you the business about being eaten by lions. I told you my daughter was a nurse there, and she said, Dad, you know, I would hear this so often from soldiers. They would talk about losing friends this way. And she said, honestly, I just couldn't believe them. Here I am in Africa, I'm being told that you're eaten by lions. It's not happening. Only when she read the fictional account did it come home to her, and she said, it must be true. So I'll tell you that this is a powerful way of getting into the imagination and allowing us to understand the question more deeply. Let's talk about some of these themes. You raised it already, Professor Downs. The question of vulnerability, a vulnerable population like this who is now poor and at the whim of whoever comes by, and also being rejected both in Kenya and in Ethiopia, what that does to you. Well, first of all, talk about this issue of the large vulnerable populations and what that means to them when they're in this situation, this refugee situation.
Well, they're really at the mercy of so many different forces. First of all, the government forces and the associated militias, sort of Arab tribal militias that were responsible for turning them into refugees and displaced people in the first place. Then, fleeing across the country, sort of at the mercy of each local village that they come upon, whether they're going to decide to feed them or attack them, which happens in one case. Eventually getting to Ethiopia and thinking finally we've made it. This is the promised land. And they cross the river and Achak says, this is not that place. Because I had visions of, you know, water and food and things being very different, but to end up in a place that looks a heck of a lot like where they just came from. And then relying for your livelihood and for hand-to-mouth food from international aid organizations, being then at the rebels who are coming through and trying to recruit, especially these boys, to then go fight for the rebel forces.
And I'm sure that you found that you know, we look at refugees and refugee camps and hear their stories and feel that it's a pretty pathetic situation. We feel bad. But when you read a book like this, you come to understand that it's an industry, that there are people, it's not just an accident, this happenstance, and well, it's hard to get food and it must be awful, and how do you get medicine? There are people who would want you to remain in that situation for their own political ends, for their own military ends. It becomes an industry. It's a business plan.
It definitely does, and this has become an issue in academic debate and study recently about the effect of IGO and NGO intervention and providing food aid and so on to refugees, because so often then part of it flows to the combatants, who then come through and say, well, we want our share, this is going to be our tax on you, which can then, of course, prolong the conflict that might have ended had, say, the rebels had to be providing for food or defending those people. And certainly, I mean, this was a ready pool of manpower. After all, they were lost boys. What happened to everybody else? The women and the young girls were often captured and enslaved, taken to the north. The adult males are killed, and so you get this predominantly young male population that's going to grow and then provides a pool of manpower.
If either of you two want to comment on that, I was thinking about it from the point of view of academic research, but if you had thoughts on that, I'd be happy to entertain those. Or I could move on because I want to talk about the cultural differences. You haven't done the research yet, and that's fine. There's plenty of time for that. The issue of cultural differences is one of the key themes in this book. Certainly, Valentino answers the door. He should have known. I mean, you would think after all he's been through, he'd be the most cynical guy in the world. And his captors laugh at him, and so do the police. What are you here? You're here in Atlanta, you're answering the door for strangers? And he's thinking, well, of course I do. That's how we were raised, So talk about the impact of cultural differences and how you began to think about your own country through the eyes of this refugee.
I mean, that's one of the themes that I thought was the most potent, and one of the things that the first-year advisory counselors that I trained and then the first years that they worked with, I think that's one of the things that really people picked up and ran with as far as the discussions that we had. Because this year's freshman class is 10% international, which is the largest international class that Duke has ever had. So that is just, I mean, that means that in any group of 10 students that you have, probably one of them isn't a Native American citizen. And that's a really interesting dynamic that Duke is really working with now, and that we have to really think about when we're talking about the undergraduate population, is that you can't assume that anyone's coming in with a certain set of knowledge or a certain background anymore. There is the need for a lot of students to learn how to get a cell phone, because that's something that you absolutely have to have on campus these days to function. Well, I think that myself.
I figure out how to get rid of mine.
Other people might disagree. But trying to figure out how to get a cell phone, if you are just get in on a flight from, I was talking to a girl, I have a friend, it takes her 3 flights to get home. I can't remember, she's from Hong Kong, and just getting home is 3 or 4 flights. How do you, and if you're showing up at Duke for your freshman year with your 2 suitcases and your carry-on bag, how do you just settle yourself? How do you set up a life? So, I mean, it's definitely, our students are coming in with the advantage of, we do have programs in place. The International House does things like that, but they're just coming in with a very different background, a very different upbringing, a very different perspective on how does life work, and just figuring out how to appreciate those differences, because they do bring valuable knowledge and really interesting perspectives and really interesting experiences. One of my really great friends is from Sweden and Stockholm, and just talking to her about growing up there it's not even that diverse of necessarily a really huge difference, but just talking to her about that is amazing. So it's definitely something that Duke is really expanding on, but at the same time, it does bring its own challenges, and just making people more aware of the difference and that existing, making sure that freshmen realize, hey, talk to someone, they might have a completely different perspective on the world and just a different perspective on life than you do, because they're coming from such a different place, is something that we're really working on addressing. And it can be a lot rougher than I think I realized, because I mean, I had a very general, basic, middle class upbringing, and so coming to college and everything like that was a very normal transition for me. So I feel like one of the things the book brought me was realizing exactly how foreign and bizarre some of the things that I take for granted on a daily basis could be to someone who doesn't come from that background. Things that could be so, as strange as it would be for me to go live in this type of situation that he came out of, that was his home. And it would be just as weird for me to go there. That's how weird it is for him to be living in America. And just realizing that dynamic is really important and really powerful.
I mean, I think one of the funniest things was when he talked about how when they first went to the grocery store and they stuck everything in the freezer because they weren't sure what the different sections were. I think they put peanut butter in the freezer. And I mean, talking about just going through the supermarket and just going through aisles and aisles of food. And these are things, I mean, I go to the supermarket every other week, there's a refrigerator I open up every day, and things like that. I think that was something that surprised me, that that's something I definitely take for granted, and that really stunned me. And also, I think talking about like the things like, why didn't you open, why would you open the door like in Atlanta and things like that. I mean, I definitely, because my parents being first generation, they were telling me like, when they were growing up in Korea, like they had a very idealized version of America, like where, of course, when you come here, everyone's gonna like, you're gonna be like, have so much food, you're not even know what you're gonna do with, like everyone's gonna eat. And I think like things like security, things like that, they assumed would be there. And so like things like, crime, they're like, crime won't happen, like it's America. So I think there are certain things that, I mean, I definitely like, seeing that, like, that I wouldn't, if I told someone like, in Africa, like, that's not the first thing I want to tell them, like crime happens in America or anything like that. I think that was surprising, seeing like, and I think also it kind of shows like, because I was in Africa this summer, like there's definitely a community feel like where you don't lock your door, and it's like a very like, and I think one thing that was really interesting, I mean, I talk about the guy when they were first being robbed, how they told him like, oh, you must be like an African prince, like, what are you doing here in like in America? I thought that was a very interesting thing that was brought up, and but yeah, definitely things I started appreciating a lot more things.
Well, it raises two interesting points. I mean, one is tolerance and understanding of cultural differences in the people you meet, but as you pointed out, it's recognizing that the air you breathe isn't air. It's made up of something, and it got to you somehow. And so understanding that, that you have cultural prejudices yourself. If you hadn't read this book, how do you come to those? But I think that's going to take us off the topic of the book, so I want to think about that. I want to think about something else, because there's a temptation here to look at the folks who robbed him and sort of compare that America to perhaps an idealized Africa, a place where when there isn't war, there are families and extended families and a kind of love, more open relationship. But this gets us to what happens to communities who are pushed aside and who are treated as second class. When you study the trauma of refugee communities, I wonder if you were reading into the subculture and the underclass in the United States of America who had been told for a couple of centuries, you're not one of us. And the impact, do we have refugees living among us, in a sense, because of a class structure in this country that can create the same kind of trauma?
That's
That's
a tough
outside the
question.
scope. Maybe outside the scope.
That's a very tough question.
Yeah.
I mean,
I have to say, it occurred to me as I read this. I said, well, trauma happens in a lot of ways, and being a victim of, being thrown out of a refugee camp in Kenya and thrown out of a refugee in Ethiopia is not unlike being told that you may not use my drinking fountain, and you're being told there's something about you that isn't the same as me, and that carries on through generations and has a way of making you traumatized, and that trauma will show up.
yeah, and I would sort of bring it back to the context of Sudan, in that one of the big causes of conflict in the country from the beginning was a sort of Islamic northern tier and a non-Islamic southern part of the country. And there were conflicts there over the South wanting more autonomy. But one of the things that really triggered the second civil war, which began in 1983, was the government wanting to impose Sharia, Islamic law, throughout the country, rather than just in the north, as was sort of allowed under the Addis Ababa agreement that ended the first civil war in 1972. And Sudan is another one of these countries, somewhat like Iraq, that was hadn't really been a unit of that type before the British came along and brought the two parts together. So already you had a very cultural clash there, and the Southerners having a large perception of being an underclass, being exploited, sort of having a colonial relationship with the North, which, when the country became independent, rejected a sort of federal arrangement and appointed many Northerners in control of posts in the South. So there was already in that inherent there, this sort of domination, colonial type relationship.
Did you feel that you learned enough about the conflict itself in this book, or that was important about some of the details of the particular conflict that led to Valentina's situation?
I feel like it was very well explained. I mean, I came at it with, I think, probably the same level that a lot of people did, which is that I knew that there were issues in Sudan. I wasn't really necessarily completely clear on who was fighting who or why ostensibly they were fighting, because often the actual why and the ostensible why can be very different. So I thought that he did a really nice job of explaining kind of the situation as it was laid out, because he does have the different levels of narration. So he has a bit more liberty to kind of narrate without it feeling and explain this is how it is, because he is explaining to people in his head, he's explaining, so he can also be explaining to the reader at the same time. So it doesn't come off. I actually am in a class where we talk about writing historical narratives, and one of the things is you never want to be that heavy-handed when you're explaining and being, because then you are writing history, which is very different than writing a narrative and a story and doing that effectively. So one of the things that I thought that the way that the book is structured allowed was to say, this is what was going on, because he's trying to explain it to people in the story as well as to the reader itself. And I came out with a much better understanding, a much clearer understanding of what was going on and what the situation was in Sudan than I did going into it.
I mean, I definitely echo that. I think it wasn't a history book, and I think it was also interesting how he's basically tying the story not to just the reader, but also to someone specifically, whether it be like the receptionist at the desk or the people who mugged him. He's telling that story to them. So I thought it was a good balance between giving the context for what it was. So I mean, you came away knowing what, why was Ethiopia a haven for people? What were the SPLA? Who are the Dinka people? Things like that. I think he gave just the right amount of background so you knew why things were going on.
What about some of the cultural comparisons in this country? He has to go to the hospital. He's all banged up. He's waiting in the emergency room, but he's going to be late for work. Can't be late for work because you're vulnerable. So he shows up all beat up, and everybody assumes, oh, those Sudanese, they're always fighting. You remember that sequence? Yeah. So here he is sort of doing the best he can against this system that just refuses to even offer the basic medical care in a timely way, and he becomes the victim of prejudice as a result of that. I mean, and so you then go out in the world and say, oh, that's where this prejudice comes from. That's how these things, express themselves.
I thought it was really interesting in that it was that question of, oh, you're from Africa, you must have the same experience as everyone else. And I feel like that's definitely something that the Duke community, the greater American community is still working out, is that taking everyone on their own terms and taking everyone for their own story, which is one of the things that this book really brings up, is that he's trying to tell them his story because his story is not what they think it is. The robbers assume that because he's an African immigrant, he must be a prince, he must be really well off, he must be privileged in some way, when he was coming out of a situation where he was absolutely being treated horribly. And he is not coming from the background that they assume at all. So just that question of taking things at face value too easily, and that was something that came to me a lot, was that you have to ask that next question. You have to ask questions about where someone's coming from and the frustration that people must feel when they're not asked about something. I mean, on a much greater level, when someone assumes something about me, I don't usually, I mean, that it can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing, but I always am like, oh, that's a weird thing to assume about me, and that's always about much more minor things than he is facing. So that was just a really effective, I mean, it was very, one of the things that really struck me was that it's that question of assumption, it's that question of assuming you know where someone's been based on just face value, looking at them, guessing where they've been from.
Definitely, I think, I mean, I'm going to echo all those things as well. I definitely agree with you on that. But also, I think it also got me thinking about, just having been abroad, like how people assume also things about Americans as well. Like, like we assume, in the book, there were assumptions about Africa, how everyone has the same experience. And, just being in like Europe and Africa, like through like study abroad and things like that, people assuming that, we're extremely wealthy, like as university students. And, things like, do you eat McDonald's every day? Like, there are definitely certain things that I thought that was interesting. Like, and I think that's something that's, like what Mick said, we're definitely working with, like, not assuming, like, I mean, I was very surprised, I guess, like, to find out, like, East Africa, West Africa, South Africa, they're, like, just totally different. And, like, I know that sounds silly, but, like I mean.
I don't know which group, the Duke Africa group always makes the T-shirts that say Africa is not a country,
yeah.
Because that's one of the things that they're trying to convey very strongly. I think that this spoke to that. coming from Sudan means something very different than coming from Ethiopia, than coming from Kenya, than coming from South Africa. Those are all, it's as different as coming from
California and like the Midwest or something.
California
like
and Florida, or Prince Edward Island versus Guadalajara, Mexico, or something like that. Like, these are not the same
But I think
quantities.
it's also interesting how looking at your own country, getting a glimpse of your own country through someone else's eyes who's not native to the country gives you some interesting insights on it. And what I found compelling about this whole emergency room scene was he gets there, he's eventually given a high-tech treatment, an MRI to scan his head, but he can't get someone to wipe the blood off his face or get a couple of stitches. He can't get any personal care. And when he goes up to the new nurse at the desk and says, well, I'm leaving, and she's, I've been waiting 14 hours. She says, you're leaving already? It's only been 14 hours. Right? So that we have, about our healthcare system, we have high-tech machinery, we have high-tech fixes, it's extremely advanced, but no personal touch, personal care, and that was, really contrasted with his experiences in his family, and you call every elder man uncle or father, and people taking other people in, and so on.
What do you make of the story behind the title, What is the What? The story that Valentino heard as a young man, and that is essentially, I think, the foundation of this. It took me a while to figure out whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. What is the what? Am I settling for, less than what I'm capable of? That seems to be, and I realized in that moment how American I was, that American optimism forces you to not settle for what you have and to kind of grasp for the next thing, and that there can be whole cultures based on sufficiency. My God, what a thought. I have enough. What did you make of that, though? I mean, was it tough for you to say, well, wait a minute, shouldn't I be going for more?
I mean, it's also like going for more, and also like, I mean, that was something where they're just like, here's a choice and here's an unknown maybe, like that. So it's like, we're not going to take that risk, and I think definitely, we definitely do take risks in America. We like definitely risk. I think we're, always saying like, if you have a chance to succeed, go for it. And I thought that was something that I looked at and go, yeah, I mean, you know what this is, like, why not find out what that is? Like, so I think
it seemed like you should side with him, and then you go, I'm not really there, right?
yeah, I definitely saw that.
I mean, to bring it down to a really different level than it operates on in the book, it's like the question of like college education. Like, all of the things that we strive for in America are our what is the what statement, and we just have such a different mentality about it. The story really illustrated, I think, more than even like the entire book could, the type of cultural mentality that he was coming from and how that had a value to it, and then he was coming to a completely different country where he had to not necessarily abandon his old one, but just recognize a new one and learn how to function in a society that works just on very different groundwork and very different base of values and everything like that. So I think that the story did a really great job of illustrating where he was coming from, and also the type of rationale behind his decisions as a character in the book.
I actually had a slightly different take on this story, which was, you first hear the story in the context of Achak. The Arab traders have come to the village and they're trading. His father is a well-known shopkeeper and businessman, and they're telling stories around the fire, and his father tells the story of the what, and it comes down to will you take the cows or you can have the what, and so the man and the woman debate, and they say, well, we'll take the cows. Those are pretty good, and someone asks, well, what is the what? What happens to the what? And they say, oh, we don't know. But we know that from what Achak says, the rest of the story is, well, God gave the what to the Arabs, right? And that's why they're second rate and second class and don't have land and are constantly nomads and sort of second class citizens. And it gave a sort of very double-edged, sort of uncomfortable feeling, but the father left that part of the story out, and Achak said, well, I felt proud of my father at that moment for not telling that part of the story to the Arabs, but still that was the sort of underlying feeling about the other group in society.
Well, I want to take some of your questions now. I'm sure you have some, and I'd be happy to hear them and have our panelists answer them. I'll take the questions and they can answer them. How's that sound? Yeah.
One of the things I saw in the book was the implicit racism in not only American society, but against this African and African Americans. Did that come up in the school discussions, or how was that?
It was definitely something that we encouraged people to talk about. We said, like, you know, like not only just differences between like foreign and like, but also because we did bring up question of we are a diverse nation, and so there were some questions about that, like going in. I thought that was like implicit racism between Africans and African Americans, or between. Okay, and I think because that was I think I think that was something that was interesting. Like, you know, like even when he said, like, you know, it was an unsafe neighborhood, and when he said that he felt that when he saw like African American young teenagers, he felt unsafe, and I was like, well, that was an interesting thing, because like that was something that struck me as well, because like so that was, I think that was interesting, that kind of showing like the differences between African, like the culture of Africa and culture of African American, how really different they've become. So that was something that we said, like, you know, to talk about the differences, like when you come to America, are there different cultures that form?
Yeah, that was definitely something that my group that I was working with said was something they didn't really know anything about, coming from where they were coming from, and it was definitely something that once they were talking about it, they said, well, I mean, it makes sense because it's two groups that get treated often very similarly, but they are not coming from the same background, they are not coming from the same value system necessarily. The idea that you would treat them the same just because they might look similar to your eyes does not make any sense. And so it was definitely one of the themes that they took as something that was very relevant for them as Duke students, as American young people and everything, that they had not really had any background with before. So they were really interested in it.
Other questions?
How
Yes,
much
ma'am.
of it is fictionalized? Or how much of it is based on something?
So based on what, there was an introduction in the book that just said that the reason why they didn't want to call it a complete nonfiction was they recognized that some of these events happened to him when he was very young, when Valentino Dang was extremely young. So they said we did make up some conversations, like when he was like, you know, between friends, and like, but they said the actual events, like the main contents of it, were very real, and I think that's been confirmed. So I think for the most part, I think that's why a lot of it, like the fact that it was slightly fictionalized, didn't take away from the book.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that, of course, you can't remember details of conversations you had when you were, you know, a young boy. But going back, I read the book and then I went back and compared it to what I thought I knew about the war, and, you know, looking back at a few books and going, okay, this was okay, the mid-1980s when the government really let loose the militias into Bahr el-Ghazal, which was the region in which he lived. And that very much sort of synced up with what I thought I knew. Then in 1991, when the Mengistu government is overthrown in Ethiopia, and the SPLA and all the refugees have to flee across the river and find new areas to settle in, that is grippingly recounted in the book and is something, you know, that actually happened. So I think there's a lot of tracking to real live events there.
And also, there is, Jin-Soo talked about this earlier, there was a part of the book where he talks about how stories that did happen to one person kind of sometimes got adopted by other people because they went through the experience together. So something that happened during one crossing gets talked about, and people that went through another crossing kind of adopt it into their own narrative. So I know for me, it never really bothered me. There was a guy that I was working with who was like, but what parts actually happened? I want like a line-by-line analysis. This happened. This was maybe a little bit made up. He's a very analytical thinker, and that he really needed to know. But for me, that story, I had such a sense that maybe this didn't exactly happen to Valentino Dang, but it happened to someone, and it could have happened to him. So that was my take on it when I went away from it, was that maybe what liberties were taken weren't liberties with what could have happened, but what actually literally happened to him at that particular moment.
Yes.
I haven't read the book, but I was wondering what you felt about the ARPA and how you came to write this book.
I mean, I've read Dave Agger's staggering work of, heartfelt work, Wow.
Heartfelt work of
You're
staggering
genius.
genius.
Heartfelt work of staggering genius. So I mean, I think
Not
that,
matchless.
definitely Dave Eggers does come in with that literary background, but I think that the story was that I'm not really sure exactly how it happened, but I believe they met and they started talking about it, and the way that they wrote the story was Valentino Dang would talk to him about it, and he kind of pieced it together, like the narrative, like interspersing the actual like present day, the American events, and then with the events what happened at home in Africa. But did that answer your question, or okay?
It sounded very much like how Valentino came to tell the story to his sponsor. He would go over to the man's house for dinner with the family. They would put the children to bed, and then they would go into the extra room and just sit down on the floor, and he would talk to him for hours about part of the story, and it would sort of move forward week by week. It sounded very much that was the process by which the book got written.
More questions? Yes.
Jin-Soo, are you going to be involved in picking the next freshman book?
Actually, Meg and I will both be on the summer reading committee, and the committee is actually composed of undergraduate students, and also there's always a first year on it as well, along with some upperclassmen, and also some faculty members, and also some staff members. And nominations are always welcome from the greater Duke community, including alumni.
So if you've read a good book lately,
Yeah.
we want to read it.
You had a question?
I have one question. I was wondering if the students talked a little bit about the Japanese gentleman working for the NGO and kind of his being involved in the story and kind of the tragic ending of his life being interrupted and that sort of thing, and also whether or not that creates a framework with students and DukeEngage and going abroad and injecting themselves maybe in some of these crisis situations, or maybe not even, but just going kind of outside and if there were conversations about that. Because I thought that was a really compelling part of the book.
Yeah, especially because he died and his family came to Africa. Yeah, that was. I think that a lot of discussions did touch upon that, and I think one of the reasons, again, why the book was selected was because Duke is becoming a global university. I mean, it is a global university, and also the world is becoming a lot closer, and there are a lot of opportunities. And I think a lot of students did take that away, like thinking about going to another nation, like. There are risks, but also there are also lots of benefits and things that you can learn from it. So I think a lot of students, even if they didn't discuss it, in the group, they definitely took that away, I think. Yeah.
So what reservations, if any, did the committee have about picking this particular?
I think one of the reservations that we definitely said was we were nervous. Like, we thought that students would finish it, but we were definitely nervous. It didn't necessarily feel like a summer reading book in the sense that
It's 535 pages.
it's 535 pages.
And my first response to Jin-Soo when he asked me how I liked the book when I got back from summer vacation was, it was really heavy.
Yeah. And I think that was one of the biggest reservations was because when students came back, they were like, oh my God, like, why did you pick this book? There was death, there was, there was so much, this guy was getting harassed, he was getting robbed, he had to go to the ER, wait 14 hours, there were so many things, and I guess other summer reading books have dealt with interesting, Durham, last year's book dealt with the race relations in Durham, the year before that dealt with biomedical engineering, but this was definitely, I think that was one of the reservations, but I think in the end, we felt that one, it was written in a way that we felt that students would finish it. We thought that Dave Eggers chose a literary style that, it felt like a novel, and it felt that way. And I think that most of the students did read it. If not, I know that students definitely enjoyed it, but I think that was definitely something, that was probably one of the biggest feedbacks we heard was it was definitely heavier than they thought.
And it does bring a lot of things to the table that I feel like there was concern when we were talking about it as the FAC board before we went to the first years was, what are they, or is it trivializing what happened here to try to find things that relate to the first year experience? And I know that was something that we talked about a lot because we didn't want to say that coming to college and having that maybe weird transition was similar to going through what Valentino Dang went through. We'd never, ever wanted to say that because we realized that it's not. But it was definitely something that brought so many issues to the forefront that it provided a lot of things to talk about, which is the other thing that the summer reading book really has to do. Because some people don't read it, so we feel like it's good when it's something that they can kind of talk about because they do have some background or because the themes that it brings up are something they can speak to. But you had something else you wanted to
We
say.
have freshmen here, and I'm just wondering, who's put the spot?
Oh, there you go.
Did
Testimonials.
they accomplish their goals of picking this book in terms of the things they set out to do? I mean, what was your take on it from
the last point I was
We'll have a good class so you can take.
Also, there's this great
Jin-Soo will
program
tell you
called
about it.
DukeEngage that this maybe inspired you to take part in.
Yes, sir.
Shouldn't the incoming freshmen better read it or else?
Oh,
That's not, that's kind of, an incoming freshman now, and
We'll
we're
tell you.
gonna discuss.
I do remember that I was concerned that there would be a test when I showed up about my summer reading. In fact, I was very, very sure that they would somehow know if I'd read the book or not. And I mean, that's something that we talk about a lot when we're talking about the first year experience, is that if they choose not to read the book, that's their first academic choice at Duke. And that they will learn that it's up to them to kind of get out of what they can, to get what they can out of the academic experiences that Duke offers. You will be given reading by professors, and if you choose not to do that reading, you will not get as much out of the class as you would otherwise. But he's not going to come, like, feel personally offended or,
Really?
well, okay, he might. A lot of professors aren't going to be personally offended, or this is their job. They go, I mean, they would prefer that you do the reading because they've put a lot of thought and effort into selecting it.
So would your parents.
And yes, they're paying a lot, but
Ask
it's
Jin-Soo.
on
I'd
you a
I'd
lot
jump up and
more.
down and yell at you.
It's on them a lot more now that they are in college to make the choice to engage in that discussion.
Well, and isn't this the time, and I have the great fortune to talk to a lot of professors from here and other institutions, there's a couple down the road, you may have heard of them. But
know what you're
one of
talking
the
about.
things that I hear over and over again is that this group of students these days are more engaged, more likely to pick up a book like this, read it, and do something about it than any other group they have seen in a long, long time, perhaps forever. And I don't know how much of that you want to validate, but I hear it over and over again. It's very encouraging to me. However, not everybody agrees.
Well, I mean, I think there is variation in any group. I think Duke is a nationally acclaimed university that attracts excellent students on the whole. But wherever you go, there's always going to be sort of variation of people who are really self-motivated and driven and really care to put a whole lot into their education, and there are others who, they sort of slide by and maybe don't get as involved as they could.
That hasn't changed much over time, same proportions. I'll let you go. Any other questions? We've got to wrap it up.
I mean, I'm just going to quickly add to that really quickly. I think, though, that Duke does a good job in the sense that there are opportunities, like there are programs like DukeEngage, there are like opportunities like study abroad that can, if you want that venue, it's here on campus, and they'll help, fund it. And so there are those opportunities on campus.
And also, I mean, it is always a small group that get these sorts of things done, but things like Wiser, which was a group of Duke students who decided they wanted to start a school in Africa for girls in an area where that wasn't previously available. That was something that was developed by students. They took it to President Broadhead, and President Broadhead was like, well, you want to do what? And they had engineering plans drawn up already and architecture already developed. Like, there is a really strong group, and I feel like the urge isn't just to help people, it's to get beyond the Duke bubble. It's to take the things that we're learning in the classroom and find ways to apply them, to take what they would learn from Professor, I forgot your last name.
Downs.
I'm really bad with names. Professor Downs, to take things that they learn in a class like that and find ways to try to do something about it. It's the doing that I feel like is something that our cohort is getting really into.
Duke and UNC students won awards for their ability to stop sweatshop stuff from showing up in the bookstores, and won national awards for that, and we're on the cutting edge of a movement. And these were students who initiated that.
So can I just add one more thing to my assessment of Duke students? Look, I mean, I've only been here 4 or 5 years, but I've met some tremendous, amazing students here that I've had the privilege to mentor. And it's our job, it's my job as a professor to motivate and challenge them to go in the classroom and to raise my voice and stomp my feet and get people excited about what we're doing at that time. I do this yesterday when people are sort of, it's sort of right after lunch, people are kind of woozy, and it's, hey, come on, people, let's go, to try and get people motivated. But I think one of the amazing things about Duke students is I have them introduce themselves in the first day of class, and every single one is, well, I'm a double major in this and this, and I'm doing a certificate in that, and they're just exploring and very ambitious intellectually. So, yeah, I think very good group.
Good group, and you were a good group as well. I want to thank all of you and thank my panelists today, Professor Alexander Downs, Jin-Soo Huh, and Megan Foran for their participation. Thank you all very much for being part of this. This chat's going to be online shortly at Duke iTunes. The session will be available to everybody, and if you want to get to the DukeReads selections for the coming year, you can go to the Gothic Bookshop just upstairs. And finally, next Wednesday, October 22nd, between 7 and 8 Eastern Time, we're going to have our first online chat this year with Melissa Malouf, Associate Professor of the Practice of English and the Director of the Office of Undergraduate Scholars and Fellows. The book we're going to be talking about is In Our Time by Ernest Hemingway. So you can chime in and type in your questions. We'll get them all on and talk about that book next. Thank you so much.